Okay. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Allow me to start by thanking the organizers, Liana and David in particular, for this invitation. It is a great privilege for me indeed to be here today. I will try to provide you with a pretty unique approach to the NTA concept, in which I have tried to utilize results of previous researches I have been part of, and I have also a proposal for how we could push the concept beyond a state of inappropriateness, which I will try to frame in what follows. Now, the structure of the presentation I will share with you is the following. I will start by putting forward my points, what I consider to be the main message of the presentation. Then I will try to indicate what I mean by recent scholarship, which is indicated in the title. And then I will highlight some of the findings which I see relevant for the statement I try to make. And here there are two particular aspects. Problems is a definition, which are irreconcilable positions of influential authors on the one hand, and there are several unintended consequences of the most clearly, most sharply defined terms of the NTA concept. And then I will highlight a growing gap between conceptual framework and the reality out in the world, which the concept tries to map. Okay, then I will provide a very, very short illustration of the problems which are triggered by these sorts of problems of the NTA definition. It's underdetermination and the gap between theory and realities. And I will conclude by some very brief, depending on the time I will have, comments regarding what are the consequences for NTA theory and research of the problems I have highlighted earlier. Now, the point I would like to make. I think that the NTA concept, as we find it in the mainstream of the relevant literature, is counterproductive in several ways. It embodies contradictions, it triggers unintended consequences, it hinders an appropriate mapping of the complexities which are to be found out of the in the world, and in fact we will see that the mainstream literature has a very, very clear regional focus which loses of sight very important additional empirical phenomenon outside this focus. And it is burdened by a very strong state bias which hides the nature of the NTA phenomenon itself. Yes, and then my proposal is that in order to go beyond these hindrances, a redefinition of the political community concept might be necessary, and we will see if a proposal I make seems acceptable. Now, the recent scholarship I refer to is first of all the very, very extensive bibliography, which you will find in the first Entan report, in the 2020 Entan report, which is really spectacular. I very, very much enjoy this literature. There are chapters, I have highlighted here just two, the theoretical part and then the case studies part, and both are really very spectacular. So I find that this is one of the sources of recent scholarship. Then the publications produced by Entan, the book which we received copies of, and also the policy papers already are really very, very important contributions to this recent scholarship. And then I consider relevant a very interesting complementary part of recent scholarship, which is regularly not included into NTA literature, but in my view addresses very, very similar phenomena outside the this focus which I'm going focus which I'm going to identify later. So what are these complementary phenomena? Fragmented and overlapping sovereignty. There are interesting cases of indigenous law, plural forms of governance, legal pluralism, tribal councils, religious autonomy, indigenous, and by indigenous autonomy I mean arrangements of land or resource management, especially in Latin America. Now, the regional areas which you will find this literature relevant for are Latin America, Africa, India, Central, South, and Southeast Asia, areas which are regularly not discussed in the mainstream NTA. And some of the authors, which I find particularly interesting to follow, is Santos, is Van der Sat, Harel Shalev, Shikova, and many, many others. I'm going to make references to some of these. Okay. Now, let's start with the NTA definition. So how do we find it in the mainstream of the literature, and which are those very influential instances of definition which trigger the problems I will highlight later? So I have listed here some of the very widely referred to, frequently referred to definitions, Hanoum, Lapidot, Suksi, and Kachuk. And just very shortly, so Hanoum said that there are at least 4 types of autonomy: personal, cultural, administrative, and territorial. By that, we could understand that all which is not territorial is non-territorial. So non-territorial, in his understanding, includes personal, cultural, and administrative. Then Lapidot says that NTA consists in personal and cultural autonomy, which applies to linguistic and cultural groups not resident in a territory. Suksi says that there are 3 types of non-territorial autonomy, which is personal, functional, and national cultural autonomy. And Kachuk then nuances further the issue, says there are personal, cultural, functional, administrative, political, and legislative autonomy, and only legislative autonomy qualifies fully as territorial, so everything which is below may be considered non-territorial. So we are going to see Tachik's approach a little bit in some details shortly, because that is important. Now, I consider that the most detailed definition of what NTA means, with a focus on legal and institutional aspects, was provided by Yupsanis in 2019, which highlights those elements which very many authors speak about partly and focus on some of those. So the first is a personality principle. The second is the minority register, which is needed in order to provide the electoral lists for electing national cultural councils. Then the procedure of establishment of cultural self-government, which is a key component of NTA, their recognition under public law of the different aspects of segmental autonomy by which the self-government is empowered. Then within certain limits, legislative powers, again associated with this cultural self-government, including tax-raising capabilities, which could be one of the sources of the sustainability, financial sustainability of the arrangement. And finally, state funding, which is expected to exist in a genuine non-territorial autonomy recognized by the state, which again is a crucial contribution to the sustainability or viability of the arrangement. Now, we could say from all the things I have summarized so far that there are 2 complementary approaches which are dominated in attempts to define NTA. One is a focus on non-territoriality, and the second is a focus on the personality principle. Now, I have reproduced here on the right of this image Michael Tachik's proposal for mapping the content of non-territorial autonomy, you see that it is a thing which is increasing in volume and increasing in depth. Yes, so it is an interesting thing that in order to have a genuine image, what NTA means, you need to take into account these 2 or 3 complementary dimensions. And you can see there that non-territorial and territorial, the border between the two is somewhere near the separation between administrative and legislative autonomy. Now, just I will come back to Tachik's proposals regarding what he means by personal autonomy, but personal autonomy, in his view, just to make this image understandable, is practically any individual right which provides some guarantees to the people to keep their distinguished cultural identity. Cultural autonomy is something which targets the community. Yes. Then functional autonomy is extremely interesting. Functional autonomy, in Tachik's view, is, I have to insert here a comment that in the literature there is another complementary view regarding the concept of functional autonomy proposed by Heinze, who suggested that the distinction between culture and functional autonomy is made by the type of entrenchment. If it is a public body, then we talk about cultural autonomy. It is a private body, it's a legal personality registered within the private law, then it is a functional autonomy. Now, some people, some authors in the literature use this type of distinction. I think that this proposal made by Tachik makes a little bit more sense, because it says that functional autonomy is, for instance, set of semi-independent institutions in an area of activity like education. Yes? If there is a community which has, of course, it has some regional territorial relevance also where those institutions exist, but educational institutions, if they are linguistically definable and they are electing their own bodies, they have some limited norm setting and rule setting capacities, then this is a kind of functional autonomy within an area. Now, if there are more such functional autonomies in a case, like education, culture, mass media, something else, then these added up together are considered to be administrative autonomy by Tachik. And there is something which is not highlighted on this image, but it says that if we take together administrative, functional, cultural and personal autonomy, then we could say that a minority which is in the possession of all these could be said that has political autonomy. Political autonomy meaning a kind of representation and institutional completeness in order to provide for the reproduction of the protection and reproduction of the particular identity. Territorial autonomy means bodies which have full power, full legislative power, and sometimes executive power is also added to that, and that is of course generated within a territorial unit according to electoral mechanisms. Okay, so that is broadly, so that is what I could summarize. So what are the most important things currently in the NTA concept debate? Now, however, I would like to show you here that there are really irreconcilable positions, for instance, as far as the personality principle is concerned. Look what interesting things we can see here. So there are at least these 4 types of senses given to the idea of personality principle. Of course, the original thing comes from Renner, who said that nations, instead of being conceived as territorial units, could be also understood as associations of individuals based on the free choice of the people. And then Suksi, who is a very, very influential author who has done extensive research, his name was mentioned yesterday a couple of times, in the Åland Islands, and not only. He says that personal autonomy implies the freedom of association as a general civil right and also the use of other general constitutional rights of an individual in the horizontal dimension. So that means that, according to this quote from Suksi, individual rights, which includes the right of association, is a precondition and the first form, so to say, of the personal autonomy, which I think many members of minority communities would be alarmed by, yes, because the problem is that individual rights in many ways are not considered by members of minorities a guarantee for what they would like to see. It is even further in this direction what Tkachuk suggests, saying that even sharper, not even, because in the case of Suksi, we could say that by the freedom of association, he's talking exactly about what Rene was talking. But Tkachuk does not say anything. He says just that personal autonomy is practically basic human right, yes, which is a pretty interesting approach. Okay, and then on the other side of the scale, we find the term the Indian personal law. Yes, Indian personal law. There are a wide complex of Indian personal laws. I'm going to mention that shortly later, which says that a body of law which applies to a person or a matter on the ground of his or her belonging or being associated with a particular religion. Yes, so that is clearly a different concept than in understanding it a basic human right. So these are some of the problems which follow from the definitional debates regarding what NTA is, where it starts and where it ends. And now trying to highlight the problems I see, which follow from these problems, I would say that we have on the one hand a pretty widely shared opinion that what makes NTA clear and undebatable is official recognition by the state, if it's possible, in public legal bodies. Yes? So that is something which is pretty dominant in the literature. Now, compared to that, if you look especially in collections of cases which were published lately, we see pretty interesting complementary realities. First of all, we have seen, and I'm going to refer to them, comparative analyses which made a very, very honorable, very sincere effort to very precisely define their area of investigation. It is, for instance, I think the most spectacular example is Balázs Dobos's comparative analysis of 5 NTAs, in which he is sharply and clearly focusing on electoral processes, how national councils are elected, and of course elections being officially organized by state authorities that result in public bodies. And the outcome of the comparison is that the sharply you, or more precisely you try to define NTA, the less effective autonomy you will find in the cases. Yes? So those cases which are absolutely accurately defined according to the literature, in fact, refer to cases where autonomy is irrelevant or ineffective. Or, on the other hand, there were other collections of cases made public recently which provide evidence of the fact that you find in the world cases which are not named autonomies, and they provide very resilient forms of genuine autonomy in spite of the fact that they are not called autonomies. Yes? Okay, so these are, now I would like to just very shortly provide some examples of these two aspects. One example is this concluding chapter David has mentioned in the introduction, of which I'm really grateful. So what we see here is it was a comparative analysis of case studies which described NTAs in Estonia, Slovenia, Croatia, Hungary, Russia, Acadians in Canada, Sorbs in Germany, Danish-German border region. Now, of course, this is a little bit here. We would go into the details and discuss to what extent Estonia is or genuine or not. So that beyond that, yes, and taking into account all this, David is very keen about this aspect regarding Estonia. Now, I have come up with this table, and just the last row is interesting when we try to assess the effectiveness of the arrangements. And what we found is that the effectiveness is low in pretty large number of cases. It is fair in some of the cases, and there is just one case, well, two cases, so there's Sami in Norway and Sweden, which could be considered strong or effective. Yes. Now, of course, I have to tell you that these conclusions are based on the data and interpretations provided by the case studies included in the volume. So there might be a further discussion whether what the case studies provided is accurate or not. Things have changed in the meantime, but that is just an indication that if you compare using some criteria, comparable case studies put forward in a certain time, that is one of the findings. Now, I make reference to the book Balázs Dobos published earlier. I mentioned his conclusion, and just Yupsanis, yes, he made a comparison between Slovenia, Serbia, and Croatia, and look what is his conclusion. He says that it would be preferable to abandon the rhetoric of cultural autonomy idea, since it is in its current form, it offers but an illusionary autonomy, serving more as a state policy of minority patronage than a useful device of minority protection. That is a pretty sharp conclusion. Of course, it's not the only one. There are many similar stances, and I think some of the researches which have been presented, which were presented yesterday in the panels, add or provide further data for that. Okay, now on the other side, we have this another comparative table which was compiled by Tove Malloy. If I'm not wrong, Tove is following us, and so I agree to her, and I express my gratitude for this collaboration we have had in the past couple of years. So this book she initiated and we put together as an edited volume, tried to map exactly this area of cases which are not called autonomies, but which, according to some sort of interpretation, has the potential of autonomy, so has the potential to be considered NTAs. And here the cases are listed up there. It's Afrikaners in South Africa, Kurds in Syria, Palestinians in Israel, Irish speakers in Ireland, Roma in Romania, indigenous peoples in Indonesia, and religious communities in the UK. And if you see, so on the right column, you will see indicators of resilience and efficiency. Yes. Now, how these are defined and measured is a difficult issue. It would need a longer discussion. But you will see that the table is dominated by high. Yes, that means that there are found that all those dimensions of effectiveness and resilience are pretty high in most of the cases. Okay, so. This is a preliminary conclusion which I would like to formulate at that point, that arrangements that fit in the commonly accepted definition of NTA regularly fall short of effective power sharing, and other cases which are not called autonomies, they have very important aspects of effective non-territorial community management. Okay. Now, dear colleagues, let's move to the other aspect of the problem, that is the mismatch between conceptual framework and empirical realities. Now, I try to suggest here, I apologize if you, I don't know whether you can read what it is there. So I tried to map here what is regularly included in the mainstream literature of NTA. Yes, and here in the middle circle, we have non-territorial national cultural autonomies, sorry, NCAs, non-national cultural autonomies, according to Renner Bauer and what followed from here. Here the cases regularly refer to the Baltics, former Yugoslavia, Russia, former Soviet Union, Hungary is included in this area, and in some instances, so the German-Danish border region is often mentioned. Sometimes even the Sorbs in Germany are offered as an example, and the Sami. Yes, these are the cases which are regularly addressed. Additional to this dominant area of investigation, there are cases of functional autonomy in the sense of Tajik, yes, which include the Canadian case regarding the Acadians around Brunswick, who have a very interesting example of institutional completeness. That is a target they want to reach, so they focus exactly according to Tajik's definition of functional autonomy on area of institutional coverage of areas of activities which try to cover the whole life of the minority and provide effective self-management and protection. And then you could mention the UK in terms of religious minorities, or Ireland in terms of language policies, which may be included here. And sometimes also consociational arrangements are included in this discussion, especially as far as Northern Ireland and North Macedonia are concerned, because in South Tyrol and in Belgium, the prevailing character is territorial. Also, there are also interesting aspects of non-territoriality there. Okay. Now, so that is, so to say, what the mainstream of NTA literature is focusing on currently. And if we raise our horizons and try to look further out in the world, of course, I forgot to mention that this first part I talked so far, with the exception of Canada, is focusing clearly on Europe. Yes, it has a very clear European bias. Now, if we go beyond this horizon, then we find a wide range of interesting phenomena, empirical phenomena, which at least has something to do with the non-territorial idea, with a personal principle or personality principle, and many other aspects which are discussed in the NTA literature. Now, very shortly, I would like to, there are three big chapters. There is, first of all, indigenous law, which is addressing the realities in Latin America. There are 5 countries in Latin America which have in their legislation, in their constitution practically, provisions which allow, which grant rights of resource management for traditional indigenous communities and generate certain institutions which I would consider to be relevant and interesting for NTA research. Then there is a wide area of the religious autonomy issue. I'm going to talk about that in the Romanian case shortly, but it is regularly ignored, the fact that churches are genuine cultural autonomy institutions. So wherever there are officially recognized churches in a country, and we know that there are many, these are, in fact, instances. Yes? And then, going beyond that, there are interesting particular forms of religious autonomy in the form of personal law in India, in Pakistan, Malaysia, Cameroon, and many other countries, yes, which have personal laws saying exactly what I have highlighted earlier, that people are singled out according to the religion they belong to, and depending on their declaration, different legal mechanisms are triggered in family law, in many other aspects. So that is a very clear. Okay. Then, very, very interesting, spectacular chapter is about sources of non-state law. And what are these? There are, first of all, recognized customary law. Secondly, non-state justice mechanisms, fascinatingly interesting. In the book I mentioned earlier, co-edited by Tove Aloy, I contributed, amongst others, in a chapter which we, together with a colleague of mine in the university, we investigated the CRIS, which is a very, very interesting institution of the Roma autonomous lawmaking. Fascinating indeed. And there are many similar cases out in the world. There are listed the names which you will find in the literature which have similar functions with the CRIS in the case of the Roma. And then there are traditional authorities, a very interesting concept. Traditional authorities which are community leaders, community councils, which have competencies in conflict management, in different sorts of adjudication, but including tax collection. Yes? So that is something good. All these are labeled in the literature as sources of non-state law, and you will see that some of these are recognized, others not, by the state. Good. You would say that it is a nonsense to imagine that the concept of non-territorial autonomy would be suitable to map what you find on the... Okay, that might be right. I'm not sure that... now, I try to push a little bit forward this category into this approach. So if you look at NTA into these three categories, yes, which is created by the state, recognized by the state, not created but recognized by the state, and not recognized by the state yet, or in limbo, whether it is. Yes? Then it's very interesting that you can list the cases I identified earlier into these three categories. You will find under the created by the state the national cultural autonomies, functional autonomies, perhaps consortial arrangement as well. And here I would like to include something very, very interesting, which is again a in-between thing. The panchayats and the lok adalat institutions in India, which are created by the state, the later is created by the parliament, and which are empowered officially to do some sort of traditional customary practice. It is fascinating. So this quasi-autonomy institutions created by the state could include all of that. And then, recognized by the state. Now, of course, there's a discussion here, but I said that when you have an national cultural autonomy, which is a private institution, you could probably say that it is an association which existed prior to the arrangement. So this the Danish-German border region arrangement, of course, it is an intergovernmental agreement-produced arrangement, but the institutional backing of it could be said that it was not created. It existed, which was empowered later on by the state. The religious autonomy, the churches and all the personal law, and sources of the non-state law which are recognized, because there are many, many instances in the literature, and you will find, as I said, customary law, but also traditional authorities, or for instance, in Mozambique, the law recognizes about 3,100 something traditional authorities and allows them to do what customary laws expect them to provide for the communities. And of course, there are many other which are not recognized or de facto exist. So the CRIS, for instance, I'm making a short reference to it immediately, is such an arrangement which is de facto recognized but not legally recognized. Good. So the second preliminary conclusion is that the NTA concept as defined in the mainstream is unsuitable for mapping these complex realities, and we are in the, well, of course many conclusions may follow here. I move on and see what we can say later. Now, so that is what I could share with you regarding what are the problems I see regarding the mainstream way of usage of the NTA concept. And I would like to provide you now an example of what kind of unintended consequences and unfavored outcomes may be triggered by this mismatch between conceptual frameworks and the reality by the Romanian case. Now, what can we say about the Romanian case? It's a fascinating story that, on the one hand, the public debate in Romania is dominated by the idea that no form of autonomy exists in the country other than local autonomy, which is stipulated in Article 3, Chapter 1 of the Public Administration Law. Yes? Other forms of autonomy relevant for ethnocultural diversity management are inconceivable, are against the Constitution. Andrea mentioned yesterday that it is declared to be against the whole philosophy of the Romanian legal system, and many others. And indeed, that is what you will see out in the public everywhere. Now, what is the reality compared to that? First of all, we have the law number 486 in 2000, the law of religious cults, which first of all recognizes 18 religions, 18 churches. And in Article 8, it says that the church is a legal personality of public utility which is organized and functions autonomously, that is the term it uses, according to its statutes and canonic codes. And further on, this text is a very, very precise description of personal autonomy. It talks about how members are identified, how the leadership of the churches are elected or appointed, and what are the rights of using languages in them. So many of the things we have seen and discussed yesterday in the cases are precisely described in this law existing in Romania. So again, there is a law which recognizes 18 institutions of non-territorial religious autonomy. Okay. And then there is a CRIS phenomenon, yes, which is a very, very interesting example of de facto personal autonomy, extremely efficient. It is limited. It is not characteristic to all Roma communities, but there are very interesting communities which observe this procedure very, and what is more interesting that there, where the CRIS has an important function and status in the Roma communities, the police is relying on it, and there is an interesting partnership of allowing the community to resolve its internal problems according to the CRIS procedures, and that is for the benefit of the overall community, and the police is very happy that this work is being carried out, yes. It is in a way unofficially empowered, yes, and it is a very interesting case of where this jurisdiction ends and where the authority of state authorities start regarding the members. Okay, and finally, this is the most interesting case. The Hungarian community, we discussed a little bit about it yesterday, is a beneficiary of an extremely spectacular, complex minority protection regime. There are many, many aspects of, well, I'm studying in depth this phenomenon. Oh, sorry. I apologize. I remain behind this. I apologize. So this is what I'm talking about. So the Hungarian minority is the beneficiary of a very extensive measures of minority regime. I'm following, researching that, and there is a database which has identified over 900, again, 900 legal documents which have provisions with minority protection content. That is spectacular. There are institutions, there are funding mechanisms, there are informal arrangements, so many, many elements of this. Now, in my reading, of course, I have to tell you that this position of mine, I'm a member of this minority, and I do a lot, well, I publish a lot, I talk a lot, and I'm not very, very, how to put it, I'm not very accepted for my position in the minority, because I say that all these things we have mount to certain forms of cultural autonomy. Yes? So if we take the definition of Tachik, then we very clearly have functional autonomy in education, in culture, in mass media, many other things. All this taken together account for administrative autonomy, and given the representative in parliament and even the government of the minority by an ethnic party, I think that political autonomy is also something which is not without sense. Okay. Now, what do we have as a consequence of this thing? This first thing which I highlighted here, that the public space is dominated by the idea that there is no autonomy in Romania, on the other hand. Secondly, this very, of course, the religious autonomy is one thing, the Roma autonomy is a marginal thing, but the Hungarian thing is very spectacular. It's everywhere. If you go out, there is a few things. You have seen that yesterday in the introduction, we have had the state secretary given by the Hungarian minority, which is a member of the Romanian government. So it's a very high level representation. Okay. So, given this complexity, I, in my terms, produced an entrapped political community in which the parts are keeping hostages one another. In what sense? That the Hungarian community cannot afford to say that what we have is an autonomy, because should they do that, then it would be out of question to achieve more. And the Romanian state cannot afford to say that this very complex measure of autonomy of minority protection arrangements, in fact, are forms of cultural autonomy. And I don't think there's a way out of this entanglement on a short run. So, dear colleagues, no, sorry. Could you go back, please? Because, one more. Okay, thank you. What is my proposal? So I've seen the problem, we have seen an example provided. What could be the solution? Well, I think that the core of the problem is that the concept of NTA has been the prisoner of a statist approach. We were dominated by the idea that NTA can the only way how we can have NTA is coming from the state. Yes, only the state has to create it or to recognize it or whatsoever. And we have seen this proposal of extending the horizon and including other cases which are pre-existing the state or are very resilient forms of community autonomy without recognition. I think the solution would be to abandon the statist bias, yes, to look beyond that and see that maybe autonomy is not necessarily, of course, it is, I don't say that recognition is not important, but maybe focusing on that limits the chances of a more genuine research. And I was very impressed by this quote I introduced here of Santos, whom I made reference to. He's investigating he's a Portuguese scholar, and he's investigating the countries which were former Portuguese colonies. Fascinating things he comes up with. He's talking about legal and normative pluralism. And he says that if you look at how the legal systems evolve, it is not some autonomy or some, I don't know, particular reason. It is the outcome of competition between mobilized elites. Yes? And when I read this, I felt very reinforced because in the book we co-edited with Tove, I made this proposal regarding how the political community could be understood not as something given, yes, which exists and it is self-evident, yes, but it is the promise or claim made by and the potential outcome of political projects. Yes? So, of course, if you look at a certain moment in history, states seem to be very hard realities. But on the other hand, it is clear that they have history, there are things which come before the state, and realities which predate the state existence. Okay. How that we could do that is that there are passive and active parts of the story. In the passive parts, we have real and constructed. So, for instance, the concept of nation and people is not a hard reality. It is a constructed reality. And all this work is done by political elites. Yes? And if we look at that, and if we take into account that the passive and real part of the story, which is a society, may include the so-called semi-autonomous social fields, yes, that is Sally Moore's term of, yes, this is something which exists and which is far beyond histories of states and whatever. We could see that depending on what work the political elites do, we might have appropriate constructions of the concept of the nation, appropriate definition of the concept of the state, of the people, and consequently of the state, and practically this kind of state construction which takes into account normative pluralism are, in fact, forms of territorial and including non-territorial autonomy. So that is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Levente, for such a rich and comprehensive lecture. We started about just before 9:15, so with your permission, I will take a few minutes of the coffee break, and I'll throw the floor open to questions, please.
was a very interesting intervention, like always. And you mentioned the literature, the Hanukkahs, the Marcus Tuxi, and so on, and different theories promoted by them. And I remember a story about the influence of the church in the Roman community, and I wrote an article in a newspaper when a Roman representative was brought in front of a priest and made him swear that he never will drink in the future, and he will never beat his wife. You know? And it's exactly what you meant in your intervention, that the church can influence the community and can be a very strong, have a very strong influence in the Roma communities, for example, as we were speaking about non-institutional forms of influence in the community, especially in the Roma community. It was just a comment.
Thank you very much.
Not a question.
Thank you. Please.
I have only one sentence. It was such a good presentation that it requires good dissemination, and I look forward to hearing it and seeing it. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's most kind of you. Thank you.
Lot from it. I just wondered, the conclusion of your theoretical discussion was the empirical reality is very complex and the concept is not suitable to capture it. I was wondering if you have an alternative. How shall we approach the topic or area differently? Do we need a new concept or a new approach?
Should I? I don't know. Of course, if I had an answer to this question, I would include it in the presentation. I don't know. I think that is, well, of course, the most convenient alternative would be to reconsider the definition. Since the NTA, of course, the term is relevant, it is very clearly delineating an important socio-political phenomenon. It would be pity to abandon. Yes, it would be pity to abandon. I remember an example of I apologize for the divagation, but I cannot resist. We all know that the problem of the definition of democracy, how difficult it is, and because it is referring to, it's coming from a very clear historical context of the classical Greeks with a very particular type of political community, and when we try to apply those things to massified huge societies, of course it won't work. And then in 1971, Robert Dahl said that forget about democracy, and reproduce it by polyarchy. And he defined very clearly what polyarchy means. And I think many, many debates whether democracy we have today and this backsliding story would be clearer, much more clearer to settle if he had accepted. He had no chance. Because such a proposal, such an intellectual proposal, it has no chance to replace something which is used by so many. So I think that this analogy works for the NTA concept as well, that it is already so embedded, so widely used. That the solution would be to reach agreement regarding changing or amending the content. And that does not mean that what has been said so far about national cultural autonomy has to be forgotten or is irrelevant. Just it should refer to something which are very clear, to which other things would be needed to added. Thank you, Andrea.
On that point, could you perhaps remind us of the title of the book that you co-edited with Tove Molloy?
Oh yeah, it's. This is it.
Non-Territorial Autonomy and Decentralization.
Yeah. Ethnocultural diversity in governance.
Can we buy this book somewhere?
Routledge.
Oh, okay.
Routledge.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Levente, for this great presentation. Closer. Okay, good. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, you know that working on this project together, World Autonomies, we realized that our European understanding of autonomy is not so similar to non-European, and they were struggling to how to fit to our model some non-European concepts. And in this line, my question goes into to what extent are we Europeans stuck with the concept of national state or nation state, for which reason we also cannot, and this, let's say, power relation, majority, minorities, national minorities, and as long as we have a dominant concept in Europe of nation state and all this, let's say, in essence, 19th century, let's say, paradigm, are we actually trapped also when it comes to the autonomy concepts and so? So this, how, to put it short, to what extent actually the concept of nation state is blocking to develop some other more sophisticated approaches to diversity management? So what do you say?
Well, thank you, Judith. That's a great question. I would say that it is not even the nation-state concept. It goes even deeper in history. It is the sovereignty concept, yes, which is coined by Jean Baudin in 1576. He published his book about the theory of sovereignty, which defined the relationship between three entities, the sovereign, the territory, and the subject, on a mutually exclusive basis, saying that on a territory there should be one sovereign, a subject living in a territory should be subordinated to only one sovereign, and so on and so forth. So, and this was a very important political innovation of the time, yes, which made possible indeed further developments. Then, of course, we reached the phase of nation-states through popular sovereignty, when the sovereignty was the people itself, and there were a lot of problems. Which this Westphalian heritage, which was mentioned yesterday by David, I think is closer to where the problems come from. Yes, and indeed, with the idea of sovereignty, autonomy is hardly reconcilable. It's hardly reconcilable. And for instance, I often say when I have the chance to talk to students about this topic that it is interesting to see how things evolved. So after the theory of sovereignty was proposed by Baudin, yes, that theory, of course, I don't think that anybody who contributed to preparing the Westphalian Peace Treaty has read Baudin. I'm not sure whether they did or not. But that was within the spirit of the time, and then practically the Westphalian Peace Treaty was doing nothing less but putting the world order on the basis of the sovereignty principle. Yes, and it was extremely interesting. So, of course, I do understand what that meant, because many sovereigns of the time were very happy by what the theory provided them with. And then I interpret, there was a book published shortly after, in 1603, Althusius. Johannes Althusius publishes a book called De Politica di Geste, which is a collection of advice to sovereigns. It is a fascinating book. I think it has a rather unique performance. During the lifetime of Althusius, it was re-edited 13 times. 13 consequent re-editions, which I think tells the fact that there's a big need for the book. Now, what do you read in this book? In this book, so the book is, according to the spirit of the time, it said advice to the sovereigns, yes, advice to the rulers. And he says that a ruler has a right, in quotation mark, to assure the dominance of a language in the territory he is responsible of it, because should that not exist, then the common understanding of the laws is unconceivable. It's a fascinating thing. In 1603, we would interpret that and would say that this Althusius was a lousy nationalist, not observing the need for linguistic diversity. No, it was a technique of power, yes, a technique of exercise of power. And so by that, I wanted to illustrate that what kind of consequences were triggered by the theory of sovereignty. And of course, these are hardly reconcilable with the concept of autonomy. Of course, I do not want to say that they did not exist, because we know that beyond that, so the legal pluralism phenomenon, yes, it is a very European, it has very European sources, so things are complicated. But just going back to your question, I think that this particular type of development of fundamental political institutions in Europe indeed created the problems for later autonomy arrangements.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I do remember Francesco Palermo, I think, gave the keynote at the last conference, and he's written, I think one of the quotes was that the problem with the autonomy debate being stuck within the Westphalian paradigm.
Indeed.
That makes it very hard to
yes, thank you.
advance beyond. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive and rich presentation. I think you have a lot to think about NTA. As you said, so sometimes state ignores the pluralism, I think, minority pluralism. Sometimes it offers a very complicated protection system that ends up to control, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, but then you can judge, let's say, the states. What about NTAs? Can you have good and bad NTAs, positive or negative NTAs? Do you have markers to check the sustainability? I would suggest as a tool to use the human rights, as you have it now. I mean, human rights principles or what we call democratic society according to the European Court of Human Rights, that would give kind of criteria to make a balance. Because of course you have sometimes a negative state control, but sometimes you have maybe negative NTA's claims.
Absolutely.
Okay, so how would put in this?
Thank you very much. That's a very, very important and great question, and particularly as far as this non-state law issue is, because that includes many cases of the kind. Now, what my position is in this thing. Of course, there are cases and cases. For instance, a problem which I have gone a little bit deeper into, the problem of the Roma-Kris phenomenon, has a lot of interpretations and indeed a very rich reality which includes cases of violating human rights. We cannot ignore that. Allowing the community to handle internal things, many problems with rights of women, rights of young-aged women and others are kind of violated by customary procedures. And this is a fact, indeed, that needs, you know what I say, as you said, we have states which are good, states which are less good, as they say. Autonomy arrangements are analogous with states. No? They are meant to do for communities a part of what states do for what we call people. No? And I think the same is true for them. You will have good arrangements and it includes bad arrangements. Of course, that does not mean that an interest or advocating for NTA arrangements is covering up or justification provided to non-illiberal practices. No, that's out of fashion. The human rights aspect is an added dimension which needs attention.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a common thing where you see cases of autonomies reproducing the very logic that they were supposed to challenge in the first place.
Yeah.
It struck me that if you're talking about sovereignty and autonomy as, you know, competing irreconcilable concepts, then the bridge between them, the common denominator has to be pluralism of all, you know, as a principle adopted across all these different levels.
Indeed.
One more, please, Ivan, and then I think we will go to coffee. We can continue the discussion, but our time is almost up.
Yes, thank you very much, Levente. That was a wonderful presentation. I think one of the excellent summaries of our thinking over the past years of all our colleagues in scholars. So your reflection and overview of recent scholarship is fascinating. I was wondering, because you mentioned the word democracy, and we kind of tend to link NTA with democracy. there seems to be this unspoken assumption that NTA is really an enhancement of democracy. And I think there is even going to be there's an upcoming volume edited by Ephraim under this title. But literature also speaks of non-democratic NTA examples, and I don't think I see them in your picture here, at least you're not illuminating them in this perspective, whether they're democratic or non-democratic. Could you please clarify how you see these maybe ancient examples of illiberal, non-democratic practices of NTA, and where do they fit into this picture, this expanded picture that you propose?
Okay. Thank you very much. That is again a very, very good question and would require a very detailed, long discussion. So I would like to focus just on two aspects. One aspect is that the reason I consider that NTA, like practically all autonomy arrangements, could be seen from the perspective of deepening or enlarging democracy, is because in most cases where the sync works, when it produces the expected outcomes, what happens in fact is that segments of a society which self-isolate themselves for certain reasons or identify themselves are included in the mainstream political institution. And any inclusion of social categories into the process of deliberation, representation, whatsoever, undoubtedly can be interpreted as embetterment of democracy. Now, of course, the second aspect of the problem is what you indicated in the question very precisely, that there are indeed examples when empowering minority communities practically establishes autocracies within a large democratic framework. And there are examples. I can give you examples when this is what happens, yes, and there are, including minority, it is not just this second part of the discussion out of Europe, where you see indeed illiberal practices, which are customary practices, and for instance, the Indian case is fascinatingly complicated. Of course, India is a very, very complex society with many, many layers of diversity. So to look at the way, so this Panchayat story or the Lok Adalat story is fascinating, how the state is forced to create artificially something which would do the logic of customary procedures. It is really fascinating. So, of course, there are many examples of illiberalism or ethnocracy within the minority communities, which when you provide authority arrangement for those communities, you practically empower the ruling elite of a minority community. Again, many states, so I always go to this analogy between states and autonomy arrangements. We have states which have also authoritarian leadership. Yes, we cannot do anything about them. Yes, they are there. And of course, you will have autonomies which produce this undesired outcome, and their measures are needed in order to deal with the situation. Yes, by no means I would say that the autonomy concept is so sacrosanct that it including the recognition of non-democratic community leaderships or systems.
Thank you. Well, it is exactly 1 hour since you began speaking about it, so all I can say is thank you again so much for a wonderful lecture, and thank you to everyone for the interesting discussion.